Good morning. Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, let's try that one more time. Just make sure you're awake. Good morning.
Good morning.
Right, good. Okay, so we can cancel the calisthenics. Good. It's my privilege this morning to introduce today's speaker, Sharon Dorsey, who will tell you a lot about Viewshed and many other interesting things. We first connected in 2018, I believe it was, when Sharon was doing what undergraduate students headed for graduate school do. She was seeking out a place to go, and for some reason, I don't know why, she thought Virginia Tech might be a good place to do a graduate degree. So she did what people do. She sent me a resume and some information. And the first thing I noticed when I looked at her resume was that she was at once a Division I track star and a very high achieving student. Well, this was a revelation to me because I've had a number of student athletes in my undergraduate classes. Mostly I never saw them even. And so the idea that someone would be a high performing athlete and an excellent student at the same time was a bit of a revelation. So that piqued my interest. But you also had many of the other things that you hope for in an incoming student. She had 2 years of experience with an environmental consulting firm, which lots of folks don't have, and that was good. But she had an entire string of undergraduate studies, and I couldn't list them all, or she wouldn't have time to talk. But undergraduate studies and internships and guest speakerships and volunteer positions, just a huge string, and all different kinds of things. And you could see, even at that stage of her career, she had this burgeoning interest in ensuring that underserved communities were enticed into conservation. So this was something that started early in her mind, and that was really good. She was, she was obviously rooted in her community, and that was important. And that's the sort of person that we hope to get here as a graduate student, always. So it took us a couple of years to get it organized, but in 2000, she finally came here, I was happy to say. And I'm mostly going to let her research speak for itself, but I do want to say one thing. One of the things she'll talk about is how she took an ArcGIS routine and took it from a giant scale down to a little mini scale. And by that, I mean, she used this Viewshed routine and routines in ArcGIS, which is normally used for things like, oh, this wind turbine, can I see it from the Shenandoah Parkway? That kind of a scale. So wind turbine, or if you're, Ted Kennedy, can I see the Nantucket Sound wind farm from my house? That was a big issue for a little while. And so she took that and turned it on its head and miniaturized this so that, essentially Ted Kennedy became the predator, the foxes or the cats, the towers became the foxes, the cats, and Ted Kennedy became the piping plover, like 6 inches tall, which I'm sure he's just made to think about, but well, he would be. But anyway, so that's what that's about. And I do believe, and then maybe I'm blinded by the light a little bit here, but I think that this new approach to evaluating habitats of ground nesting birds is going to provide huge opportunities to change the way we think about not only habitat selection of ground nesting birds and behavior of ground nesting birds, but really the coevolution of habitat and behavior. So look for that to be happening. And I'm sure this paper, her studies are going to be highly cited and highly emulated, I believe. So one other thing I'd like to mention about her before turning this over to her is that her involvement with communities has been constant. She has been doing the same thing at Virginia Tech as she did as an undergraduate student, being involved with the community and particularly with this passion for getting underrepresented people to be enticed into conservation. And so just to give you a couple of highlights of that, she was active in the manners. I always get the actual title wrong. Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Science Manners. And she served as president of that organization at one point. She wrote and filmed and produced an autobiographical documentary detailing her experience as a woman of color in conservation. She was named a University Diversity Scholar and hosted a screening of that film on racial equality and conservation. And with that discussion was centered around that film. She contributed a book chapter to for a book titled "Been Outside: Adventures of Black Women, Non-Binary Gender, and Non-Conforming People in Nature," and you can look that up on Amazon. You can buy it if you want. She mentored several undergraduate students of color in the College of Natural Resources and Environment. She established a partnership between CNRE and a Black-led nonprofit providing outdoor education opportunities for Roanoke youth. I think that was maybe the most fun thing she did. She's always smiling when I see pictures of that. She spearheaded the creation of an after-school wildlife education club in the local elementary school, which is still ongoing today. And she was selected as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Diversity Fellowship program participant. And she recently had the opportunity to meet with a small group from those people with the Secretary of Interior. So she found herself sitting across the table from the Secretary of Interior, telling her, the Secretary, how she could get more underrepresented people into the Department of the Interior. And she's still running. She just completed her first marathon recently. So with that introduction, please welcome Sharon to this.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the introduction. It is crazy to think of all the things I've done since I've been at Virginia Tech. It's truly been an amazing experience. I'm thankful for everyone that's been here today and throughout this whole journey. I'll start with this presentation so y'all can see what I've been doing all these past 3 years. So again, I'm Sharon Dorsey. I'll be discussing a culmination of 3 years of work in the field, working with geospatial programs, as well as attempting to use statistical software to enhance our understanding of piping plover nesting ecology. So before we dive in, I'd like to frame this investigation in a way that maybe we can all relate to. Science communication is a budding passion of mine, so I'm gonna exercise that today too. So let's assume it's time for your annual vacation to your favorite beach. Rental reservations for your beach house still need to be made. And how do you decide which one you want to choose? Typical things that people might consider include proximity to good restaurants, access to places for recreation, and of course, places to relax that offer peace and quiet, which you'll need after working so hard on your thesis. Although you make this trip year after year, there are slight differences with each visit. Restaurants start to close, there are more rowdy teenagers on the beach, and financial costs are increasing. So there's fewer properties that fit all of your original criteria. How will this affect your decision to choose your property? Do your preferences start to change? Do you start to cave on certain things? And on top of that, more and more tourists are discovering your favorite beach, and the good rental properties are being reserved quite quickly. So each spring, piping plovers plan their own summer vacation as they prepare for their breeding season. Plovers within the Atlantic coast population migrate from the Caribbean and the Southeast United States up to beaches in the Northeast. Like humans, they routinely return to the same beach year after year. And some plovers also consider various things regarding the location of their beach house as well. And some of these factors include access to food, the level of human disturbance around their site, proximity to dunes where predators may reside, and the risk of flooding with their nest site. And so my research continues to delve into this. These factors affecting piping plover nest site selection following landscape and predator community changes. I do need to mention that this research is part of a larger long-term study of this population and heavily dependent on efforts of my predecessors. So during the seminar, I will begin with an overview of the background of the study system, which is a barrier island on Long Island, New York, called Fire Island. I'll introduce my study species, which is the piping plover, a species listed and protected under the Endangered Species Act. I'll move into my first chapter, where I describe the influence of several habitat variables on nest site selection as the landscape underwent ecological succession, and how I assessed changes in the amount of suitable plover nesting habitat during substantial changes. Then in my second chapter, the one that Jim is really hyping up, I will evaluate the role of a vision-based factor on plover nest site selection in the context of a shifting predator community. I also identify the primary source of visual obstruction on the landscape. And then I'll conclude with summarizing my main findings for both chapters and the implications they have for plover conservation. So with that, let's begin. So I'll take you over to the Northeast United States. You'll see in this inset map where we're kind of talking about. Off the coast of Long Island, New York, is a small, long island called Fire Island. This barrier island is about 50 kilometers long and about 400 meters wide, very narrow. It's bordered by the Great South Bay to the north. You can probably see this. Great South Bay to the north and the Atlantic Ocean to the south. So the figure shows the 4 primary beaches that we surveyed, which are managed by county, state, and federal partners. And the vertical lines there, they're not demarcating any inlet or any break in the island. It's actually just a 25-kilometer stretch of a residential community that we omitted from the study because there's very little plover activity there. So it's really a continuous island between Old Inlet and Fire Island Inlet. So this is a picture of what Fire Island actually looks like. You can see the expansive sandy beaches, but also patches of vegetation, mostly towards the bay side, to the top left, and there's those green patches. So barrier islands support complex communities of vegetation within their ecological zones, ranging from bare, grasses, shrubs, forest patches, and salt marshes. And barrier islands are ever-changing environments experiencing gradual, natural geomorphological processes like vegetation succession, which is the expansion and progression of the vegetation community toward the climax stage, or from a grassland to a forest. So on the other hand, storms cause more sudden changes to the barrier island landscape. And Hurricane Sandy reached the shore of New Jersey as a Category 1 storm in October 2012, bringing extreme winds, rainfall, snowfall to the Northeast. And on Fire Island in particular, on these right panels, this hurricane caused breaches at various locations where channels were created that connected the ocean waters to the bay. You'll see circled here docks that were attached to the land pre-hurricane, and then post-hurricane, this breach channel formed, and those docks are not really serving their original purpose. Additionally, you'll see substantial overwash that occurred post-hurricane, where sand is covering vegetation and dunes are also flattened. So the extensive destruction caused by Hurricane Sandy prompted a beach stabilization project led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that would reinforce the island ahead of any other large-scale storm. The project involves filling breaches and nourishing beaches with new sand, building dunes within the overwashed areas, as well as planting them with American beach grass for further stabilization. Also, to mitigate the impact of any beach stabilization efforts to piping plover nesting habitat, the Army Corps engineered plover restoration areas, which were designed to provide open, flat, dry sand nesting habitats for these birds. And 2 were developed in early 2015 in the eastern region of the study area. This is a picture of one of them, the larger one. So the Fire Island landscape is home to several terrestrial predators, and the red fox has been regarded as the primary predator of the plover, depredating their eggs and their chicks, while northern raccoons, Virginia opossum, and really domestic cats or feral in these environments have also been noted to depredate certain life stages of this bird as well. So piping plovers are small migratory shorebirds that were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1986, following population decline that was attributed to habitat loss, recreational use, and predation. The Atlantic coast population, which inhabits beaches from Virginia to Canada during the breeding season, is considered threatened, which is less severe than endangered. And the population at some breeding grounds is increasing, but it's decreasing at others. Within Fire Islands population, we've seen since Hurricane Sandy a 5-fold increase from 26 pairs in 2013 to over 100 pairs in 2022. So it's great that these plovers are increasing population here in Fire Islands. And many of these beaches used for plover breeding grounds are also recreational here in Fire Island. And land managers often erect signage designating areas as closed to pedestrian vehicle use to protect plovers during their egg laying stage in April until their chicks are hatched and fledged in August. So these are the picture of one of those signs you would see on the beach. And piping plover chicks are precocial and very cute. And they begin exploring the grounds and their landscape within the same day of hatching. They do largely remain with their parents for protection, and they also feed themselves by foraging on the grub in wet intertidal zones alongside their parents. But in order to inform conservation strategies, plovers have been extensively researched, especially their breeding behavior. We've learned that during courtship, males make these scrapes, these nest scrapes, which are simple depressions on the ground. You can kind of picture when you're walking on the sand, the small holes that your feet leave behind. And then the female will select the scrape to lay their eggs in. And although plovers use habitat features to inform the nest site selection, they also have very high site fidelity, meaning they'll return to the same nesting location almost within the same 30 meters sometimes, year after year. They're very loyal to that same site, even as the landscape changes. So my first chapter, post-hurricane habitat changes in the long-term behavior response by the piping plover, investigated how various habitat features affected nest site choice as the environment evolved through vegetation succession. I also evaluated shifts in available nesting habitat for plovers during different landscape stages post-hurricane. So there's been minimal large-scale habitat change within Fire Island since the beach stabilization concluded in 2015. And when undisturbed, we know that vegetation succession progresses on islands, on island landscapes. So we expected it to happen here too. And so we were curious, how would nest site selection for these factors shift as the island underwent succession? And what's considered suitable habitat, how that would shift as well. So my primary objectives for this chapter were to study the ecological succession by estimating vegetation coverage in the years post-disturbance, so after 2013 and onwards, to use a logistic regression to assess the effects of various habitat characteristics on plover nest site selection in the years post-hurricane, and then to measure the amount of suitable nesting habitat to plovers before the hurricane, after island stabilization, and in the years following ecological succession. So 3 main stages, measuring the suitable habitat. So we acquired 2010 nest location data from local land managers, but began post-hurricane nest monitoring in 2015. Between 2015 and 2020, we conducted daily nest searches from early April to July, which involved walking transects within the nesting habitat. Once we found a nest, we recorded its location using a handheld Trimble GPS unit. Aerial imagery from the spring was acquired, and we performed a supervised classification in ArcMap, which is a geospatial software, to classify each pixel as either vegetation or dry sand. And dry sand is denoted in this figure in kind of the tan yellow color, and then vegetation, of course, is in green. To quantify post-hurricane succession, we counted the total number of pixels classified as vegetation within the study area and within the 30 meters of plover nest sites to get a sense at a local level how vegetation is changing within their nesting sites. We also investigated 7 habitat variables, which were previously tested by a former lab member. And we measured these variables in pre-hurricane conditions in 2010 and post-hurricane conditions from 2015 through 2020. And I'll briefly review each of these 7 variables in these next couple of slides. So first, we used light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, which we acquired by plane, to develop an elevation model of the entire islands, the entire study area. And in this image, you'll see that the darker colors are indication of lower elevation, and the lighter colors are the higher elevation. And you'll see a long white line of the dunes running parallel with the ocean shoreline. So again, that's where the higher elevation is. And we extracted nest elevation from this layer, and which can determine the nest flood risk and exposure to wind. This is kind of why we chose this variable. We also use elevation data to identify ocean and bayside intertidal zones. And the intertidal zones are where plovers are known to forage. With this information, we calculated a Euclidean distance to bay, a least cost distance to bay, Euclidean distance to ocean, and least cost distance to ocean. So Euclidean distance can be thought of as how the bird flies as the adults reach their foraging sites, but least cost distance is the path that flightless chicks would have to take to avoid vegetation in any pools of water to get to their same foraging habitats as adults. And this could be a consideration as plovers choose nest sites as well. So we wanted to factor that in as well. We also utilize elevation data and classified imagery to identify backshore barriers in the nesting habitat. This was essential. This is essentially to measure how wide the flat sandy part of the beach is. And we outline the barrier line and assess the beach width. You'll see that here. Here's the back barrier line. And it comes up to here where the vegetation begins. And we determined these widths at 10-meter increments to calculate the variable backshore width. And plovers benefit from nesting on wider beach sections, which offer ample space between the flood risk from the intertidal zones, as well as reduced risk of predation from being close to the dune lines. And lastly, as an indicator of human disturbance level, we measure distance to any developed features, such as parking lots and marinas, docks, where human activity would be high, because we know that plover survival declines in areas of high disturbance. So in this figure, the darker areas to the left, you're right, this side. This is the areas that's closer to development. This is like a parking lot over here, and the areas to your right are lighter, so indicating further from development. We calculated values of each variable for nests, every nest each year, which represented used sites. And we also generated random points in dry sand every year, which represented available sites. And we modeled nest site selection with the binomial regression with additive variables and an interactive effects of year. And using the results of this regression, we modeled all dry sand for suitability. And we established a suitability threshold of 0.2, and values greater than 0.2 were considered suitable, and less than 0.2 were unsuitable. And so this intermediate stage of a suitability map, which is not quite, finished in this figure, you'll see that the areas in the lighter colors would indicate a higher probability of a nest being present there, whereas the darker colors would indicate a less likely probability of a nest being there. You'll see in the more narrow stretches of the beach is very low, wider, further from development, a bit more likely to have nests there. But we'll get into those final results soon. So let's get back to vegetation succession over time. So we see that veg coverage in the study area during the breeding season post-hurricane, starting in 2013, was about 10.5% across the landscape. But following the creation of a restoration area, veg cover across the island was reduced slightly to 8, but then the amount of vegetation actually doubled between 2015 and 2020 in those 5 years of just unimpeded vegetation succession. And overall, between 2010 and 2020, we did notice a 90% increase in veg coverage across Fire Island. Within the easternmost region of the study area, which experienced extensive hurricane impacts. I want to kind of highlight this area in particular. There was an overall 66% increase in veg coverage, but that can also vary region to region. In this, there's 3 regions I want to really focus on right in this area. This one section in red, this is an area where overwash was substantial, but between 2013 and 2020, you see a 400% increase as veg redominated that section. In the second area, highlighted in yellow, this is an area next to a breach fill. You'll see actually increase of 200% veg coverage from 2013 to 2020. And then in the restoration area, which was developed in 2015, you'll see a pretty substantial, difference between 2014 and 2015. This is when this restoration area was created, and it persisted. Through all these years, it's pretty much stayed unvegetated. So there's variation in how veg redominated the landscape. Within the nest sites, I wanted to highlight how the same kind of trend continued. Vegetation definitely increased at nest sites as well. And between 2015 and 2020, the years we studied the nest locations, there was a 4,000% increase between veg within 30 meters of a nest, which is pretty notable. And I kind of show the comparison values for random points to show that vegetation was also increasing at those points as well. But within nest sites, it was pretty substantial. But I do want to get over to our nest site selection analysis. We recorded a total of 353 nests and 1,412 random points over the span of our study. And we will review the selection of each variable in the years post-hurricane next. But I do want to point out that we removed one variable, which is the Euclidean distance to ocean, because it was highly correlated with least cost distance to ocean. So you'll notice that there's only 6 variables we'll discuss in these following sections. So to orient ourselves with this figure, you'll see that on the y-axis will be the name of each variable. This one shows backshore width. You'll see the x-axis is the years relative to the storm, ranging from -2, which is 2010, up to 8, which is 2020, because the year is relative to 2012, the Hurricane Sandy. Lastly, you'll notice this color, you'll notice this dashed vertical line where Hurricane Sandy occurred in 2012. And then you'll see these color-coded box plots where the lighter color is nests and the darker color is random points. So you'll see for backshore width, we observed that nests and random points were occurring in wider sections of the beach post-storm, which is likely a result of the many overwashed areas following the storm. We also saw that in distance to development, there was increased distance of both nest and random points post-hurricane, likely due to habitat creation in areas further from human infrastructure and more options to nest and more options of minimal disturbance offered post-hurricane. Euclidean distance to bay, nest values decreased post-hurricane, while random points remain relatively constant. The storm created bayside access for plovers that they seem to take advantage of by nesting closer to in the years post-hurricane than they did in 2010, where there was limited access to the beach or to the bayside. And values changed greatly for least cost distance to bay. This decrease again was because of the access to bayside habitat creation post-storm. While there was much more vegetation previously, the storm again buried a lot of it, allowed for more direct paths and direct routes to the tide line in many areas. So the least cost path is very, very almost Euclidean for some places. Whereas least cost distance to ocean, nest distance to ocean varied greatly across the years, and nest and random points were slightly further from the ocean in 2015, likely due to the ability to nest more central to the island now that the beach width was wider. And these figures, actually going back a little bit more, these figures on the right, the blue line, this blue area indicates being closest to the bayside habitat, which is this black line up here. And then to get to this bayside habitat, these birds would have to go almost from right to left. That's why this is further and this is a bit closer. And same thing for least cost distance to ocean. To get to this black ocean intertidal line, blue is closest, green's a little bit closer, but red would have to go all the way around, vegetation to get to the ocean intertidal line. That's how least cost was measured. I'll skip over to elevation. So this remained relatively constant, before and after the years of the storm. So not much really changed post-hurricane. We also explored, as we explored annual selection for these variables using our regression, we noted that the effect of most variables on nest site selection post-hurricane was similar pre and post-hurricane, but there's 2 exceptions, which I want to highlight here. These exceptions are shown here in these standardized effects plots. And so the strength of the selection in a given year is shown relative to its strength in 2010. So if the error bars overlap 0, then the selection for that variable is not different than pre-hurricane. And if the bars are left or right of that 0, that indicates selection was different than 2010 selection. So we see that distance to bayside intertidal habitat was different post-Hurricane Sandy for a certain number of years, 2016, 2018, and 2020. We also observed that selection for distance to development was different in 2015 relative to a selection in 2010. And these annual variations definitely still need to be further explored and also inform our interpretation of our suitability maps. So by incorporating the annual effect of the effect size of each variable, we modeled suitable nesting habitat pre-hurricane, post-stabilization and post-restoration area creation, and post-ecological succession. And the percentage of suitable nesting habitat is listed above each map section. The amount of suitable habitat increased from 29.8% to just over 50%, largely due to the creation of the restoration area highlighted in white, which added over 25 hectares of suitable nesting habitat for plovers, which that's amazing. Unfortunately, suitable habitat did decline a little bit in the post-succession period to about 36.8%. Again, likely due to vegetation increasing and less available dry sand for them to nest. So a lot has changed within the landscape, but I do want to switch over to my second chapter, where I'll be introducing another new variable, the view to see predators as a potential factor in plover nest site selection. And here my goals were to assess how the view of their surroundings to detect predators would affect where plovers build their nests, and also to determine the main visual obstructions on the landscape. So plovers have evolved a unique defensive behavior used against predators that approach their nest. During this broken wing display, a type of injury feigning, plovers, of course, act injured, tempting predators to approach them and not their defenseless nests. Plovers deploy this defensive behavior once the predator has been detected. So it's been widely believed that an open view of surroundings may allow birds on the nest more time to see that approaching predator. The term viewshed was coined to describe that area of open view. However, measuring viewshed has proven difficult in a field setting. Custom-built periscopes, like the one shown here on the right, were used in studies during the mid-2000s, and the apparatus was placed over the nest scrape following hatching completion as a way to not disturb the nest while it's active. And a movable mirror is inside, which is directed at this window, and allowed researchers to estimate the viewshed of an incubating bird a full 360 degrees around the nest. The study also recognized visual obstructions that vegetation caused and limited the view of threats like people and dogs. And while this was a very innovative approach, this requires substantial physical labor in collecting measurements this way. Another aspect in consideration for this study is that the predator community composition has changed drastically. And beginning in 2015, as a result of the mange outbreak, which is a kind of a body wasting condition in red fox, this population declined substantially and eventually was wiped out from Ireland completely. And red fox were the primary predators of plovers, so I was curious if achieving viewshed to see them would shift in priority for plover nest site selection now that they're no longer on the landscape. So our objectives here were to test whether viewshed was greater at nest sites at random points, essentially seeing if plovers are selecting for greater viewsheds, to determine if adding viewshed improves the predictive ability of a previous model of nest site selection, to determine if the strength of viewshed and nest site selection changed over time, and then to characterize the relative importance of vegetation and topography and obstructing viewshed at plover nest sites. So methods for this chapter were largely repeated from chapter 1, and they involve nest searching, calculating values for several habitat variables, and again recall that Euclidean distance to ocean was removed due to its high correlation with least cost distance to ocean. So 6 variables we considered on top of viewshed. Again, we also utilize aerial imagery for land cover classification, as well as a LiDAR elevation model to characterize landscape conditions that may impede a plover's view. And while many studies have recorded vegetation coverage, it only tells a horizontal story. It does not include the vertical component. So to account for that and how vegetation can be a vertical obstruction, we decided to get samples from the landscape as well. So we already had ground elevation from the LiDAR to account for topographic elevation, but we also wanted to incorporate estimations of vegetation height. So we used heights collected from randomly selected points in 2016 and 2017, and then we visited those same points in 2022. And at each point, we placed a 1 square meter quadrat and recorded the max height of plants using a Robel pole, this kind of color-coded stick that my colleague is holding. And these heights were used in a linear regression to estimate the annual median vegetation height across the study area to get a sense of, how much did the vegetation grow from this year to this year, and kind of extrapolate that across the landscape as an estimate of how tall veg is each year. And so we combined vegetation and elevation data to set the parameters for this tool viewshed in ArcGIS Pro to compute the visible and not visible areas within a 30-meter buffer of points on the landscape. And so we chose 30 meters based on the average flush distance, so the distance where plovers will just vacate their nest when they're feeling a disturbance. And another adjustment we made that Jim mentioned is that we set the observer height. So this plover was set to a height of like 6 inches as the observer height to account for, they're not on the ground, they're not flat, but the height that they are seeing the landscape at. You can see kind of a visual here to represent what I was just describing. Within the viewshed tool, there's another setting that we used to classify the target height. So you see in this first figure, if the target was shorter than the hill, then it would be classified as not visible. But since it is taller, it is visible. And so given the decline in red fox population within the study period, we established 2 ranges for this target height. A range where red fox would be visible, but the shorter predators may not be. And then a range where the shorter predators would be visible, and by default, foxes would be too because they're also taller. And then we later tested to see which range of target height was more informative in predicting where plovers would place their nests. And this is kind of like a visual representation of the nest, and where no predators are visible, foxes would be visible here, and then all foxes, cats, raccoons would be visible in this group. The other part of this analysis involved incorporating viewshed variable with the other 6 habitat variables, where we performed another regression to see how adding viewshed affected the performance of the nest site selection model. And in this analysis, we ended up comparing a total of 8 candidate regression models with varying additive and interactive effects, including the year since storm, since we recognize the variation that years in storm could have on a variable strength. And we ranked each model based on its predictive ability to ascertain where plovers would nest on the landscape. And then our last objective, to determine whether vegetation height or topography was a greater obstruction in plover nest sites. We calculated another viewshed, but only using ground elevation. So no vegetation was added in this scenario. And then we subtracted the results of those 2 viewsheds to isolate the contribution of each obstruction type to a plover's not visible area in their viewshed. So let's get into what this viewshed really looks like. So here's an example of a viewshed output for a nest on a landscape from the perspective of an incubating plover. So the visible area is kind of in this lighter color, this tan, and the not visible is in gray. So vegetation is in this green layer, the color is green as well. And you'll see that areas where it's not visible behind that green indicates that vegetation is likely the culprit of that obstruction. And areas where it's gray indicates that topography was the culprit of that obstruction. From a different perspective, I'm a visual learner, so having different angles helps me. So this is a cross section of that same kind of scenario. You'll see that for about these first 8 or so meters, this is distance from the nest. So here's the nest. These first 8 or so meters is considered visible. But then between the slight raise in elevation and the height of vegetation, it's no longer visible, this area behind this point. So any predators back here, plovers wouldn't be able to see that. So it's really interesting to kind of get a visual sense of what plovers could be seeing on the landscape using geospatial technologies like these. So this table is a summary of the various models that we compared. We won't spend too long on this because tables aren't very fun. But I want to point out that the weight on this far right side indicates the likelihood of the model in its predictive ability, and whereas one's the most likely. You'll see that the model, including the large predator viewshed, was the top ranked and the top weighted. And you can also see that looking at the AIC value on the second end column, the relative rankings of the other candidate models. And every model that included a viewshed performed better than the one without it. I think it's an informative lesson from this study. We also found that viewshed is greater at nests than random points, confirming that plovers select areas with open viewsheds than would be expected at random. And that's demonstrated in the standardized effects plot, where viewshed coefficient value is on the positive side of this middle line, which indicates a positive association with nest site selection. And then we also realized that over 70% of nests had at least 50% visible area to see terrestrial predators, which is shown on this histogram. And although plovers generally selected for greater viewsheds, when we incorporate this annual variation, we saw that the influence of viewshed on plover nest site selection actually weakened over the course of the study. This is observable by the shrinking difference in these mean values of nests at random points over time. And then we also notice a negative coefficient value for our beta when we included the interaction of a year with large predator viewshed. And lastly, we determined that topography obstructed plovers' view of predators more than vegetation. Within the 30-meter nest buffer, the median percentage of obstruction caused by vegetation was only about 0.2%, whereas the median values for topography that obstructed vegetation was 13. So topography has often been kind of like under accounted for in terms of like the culprit for view. So this is really kind of eye-opening that topography has a larger role than we believed in obstructing the view of plovers in the landscape. And as we conclude, and keep in mind of time, I want to review the main findings of each of my chapters. My first chapter found that vegetation has increased substantially in the nesting landscape in the year since the hurricane. And that plovers' largest selected habitat features similarly post-hurricane, as was demonstrated pre-hurricane. And that suitable nesting habitat peaked after stabilization and after the creation of the restoration area, but subsequently declined as the landscape changed from ecological succession. And then in my second chapter, I determined that plovers do select nest sites with greater viewshed, and it's really awesome that we can now measure it using this technique that was developed in this study. We also realized that adding viewshed improved the predictability of the previously created model, and that the influence of viewshed diminished as the landscape changed, which is an important factor to keep in mind. And then the last thing that we realized was that topography was a greater source of visual obstruction than vegetation. So as we conclude, in an ever-changing landscape, plover selection may remain constant for some features. And viewshed gives us a new perspective to use in shorebird management. So thinking back to the beginning of this talk, I want to leave you with this, that when you're making decisions on your next beach rental property, your decision making is not so different than the piping plovers. And if you're ever so fortunate to be on a beach with them during your vacation, please respect their space and their nesting period. So thank you. I want to, of course, cite all the people that I cited throughout this talk, and continue on with my acknowledgements of everyone that has gotten me, to where I'm at. I want to begin with, of course, thanking everyone that's in attendance today on a Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. It's a bit early, and I appreciate everyone's interest in me and my work throughout all these years. I want to acknowledge the traditional land stewards of the site that I was able to work on for so many years, as well as the current land managers and the funding sources that made this work possible. As I reflect on this journey, I need to acknowledge how I've been adopted by professors outside of my department as well. Within the Department of Sciences, Dr. Austin Gray and Dr. Dana Hawley have been amazing mentors and instructors that give me opportunities outside of my college, as well as the mentors within this department. I've been able to do additional opportunities that have helped me grow professionally. So Dr. Willa Chavez, Dr. Carol Haas with Manners. I've been doing so many more outside of shorebirds, other bird banding opportunities, with Dr. Ashley Peel. And I also want to thank other mentors and friends that have really kept me on this path. I'll give a shout out to Dr. Miriam Cameron within the College of Natural Resources and Environment. Thank the IT department, who's helped me so much. The IT is amazing and very patient, and all the other department administrators. And I want to conclude with my lab. So my amazing advisors, Dr. Jim Fraser and Dr. Dan Catlin, have been amazing co-advisors. My other committee members are Sarah Carpentry and Dr. Sam Robinson, who is here virtually. I've had the privilege to have an amazing cohort of other lab members, which I will show more pictures of on these next couple of slides. The crews that worked with me in Fire Island, for data collection, have been amazing. I've had opportunities to do things I never thought I would do, back in 2020 when I first reached out to Jim. And I love this photo of Jim and I. We did not plan this day. We really did not. And like, oh, we have the same shirt on. And I don't wear glasses like that, but I had to match him, so we wear glasses. But I've had an amazing lab community that has been so supportive, very kind, been along these steps with me every step of the way. A range of crew members from the past 2 years of fieldwork I've done, as well as the friends I've made here at Tech. I did not know who I was going to meet when I started here and during COVID. It was very isolating. We didn't have any classes in person. So fortunate to have an amazing friend down the street that I happened to meet, in Katie Slack. And we went on walks and just kind of got to know each other, like outside when we were safe to. And after COVID restrictions lifted, I met so many more amazing people through shared interests, through classes, through extracurricular activities, through shared identities. So I'm so grateful for all the friends I've made here. And it's bittersweet to, be leaving, but I know y'all all will be with me through everything I do after this. I want to thank my friends back home that have been with me through high school, college, some of them since preschool. And I appreciate their interest, even if it was feigned, in piping plovers. They've gotten a lot of information about birds that they did not really want to know or care to know. But I really love sharing communicating my science to them. and trying to make everyone more conscious of their efforts, of plover conservation, and how we can all play a role in just wildlife conservation. I want to definitely thank my partner. Austin has been with me for 10 years. We've rocked this long distance relationship, so I'm grateful for his patience, support, especially this week. So
Great.
And then my parents and my family have been amazing and are my biggest cheerleaders through everything. All my sporting events, everywhere I go, my parents are always there. It's insane. But I'm so grateful for my community, my village, my extended family. I'm just so supported through everything that I do. It's indescribable how much support and love I get. And I'm just so grateful for everyone, and especially people that came today. I really appreciate everyone that came today. So I will get myself together and take some questions. Oh wow, this is the one picture that I wanted y'all to see. Well, it all went so smoothly till now. Yes, I'll take any questions. Thank you all so much.
Well, I'm here to help with questions.
Yeah.
That is absolutely one of them. Very good. So,
Okay.
anything and then we'll start looking at the chat.
Michaela will be handling questions in the chat. I expect now to speak congratulations and things like that. But yes, any questions or comments, or I can go to Michael, and then Jane, help me remember to ask their question.
Oh, well, that was a great talk. Nice job. I was curious why the restoration area didn't seem to like revegetate in the years following the hurricane, but like the rest of the island that had some restoration did. Was there something they've done to like keep vegetation away, or something about what they did that prevented it from happening?
No question. You want me to say? Okay. I'm gonna get the star up here. So the question is, why did the vegetation not grow in the restoration areas?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Michael. Yeah, it's a combination of the techniques that were used when they created the restoration area. So the way that the Army Corps really kind of dug in and but they really dug deep into the soil so that any roots of any of the vegetation that was there previously could not kind of reemerge. A lot of beach vegetation has to be very resilient and have strong root systems to stabilize those dunes. But if you get deep enough, they are no longer there. So in certain regions where the intention was to create long-lasting, persistent habitat for plovers, they really dug into the sand deep enough to make it effective long-term, which they did, which is awesome to see and confirm that.
So you mentioned how terrestrial predators sighted 30 meters towards the nest, they would vacate the nest. But I was also interested in if they had any aerial predators, so birds of prey. And if they do, how does that affect the view shed?
So the question was whether or not aerial predators affect the view shed.
Yeah, that was definitely something I had wanted and explored in this research, but time constraints and just how to incorporate that. So some of the aerial predators that plovers do face on Fire Island include peregrine falcons, as well as other like gulls and other large just birds, shorebirds. And although those birds will likely go after their eggs and chicks and things like that, and it's hard to say how the view shed how to measure the view shed like depends. You would think it'd be clearer, right? So like just looking up most times it's like very, very open. Because plovers aren't nesting kind of like in vegetation, so they have a very clear view of above them. We couldn't really get a good sense of how they respond in terms of like flushing, from the aerial predators, but I imagine they will flush as soon as they see the predator. Unfortunately, in the years I did study, I did do field work, there was a decent amount of aerial predation, often to the chicks. So it's not so much during the nesting stages. Another important factor that I didn't really mention is that the nests on our landscape have these exclosures on them. So there's almost like these wiry cages that prevent predation from all animals. So measuring their success in the study was kind of like hard because there was this barrier that inherently uplifted success. So aerial predation on these birds more so happened during the chick rearing stages where they're just out running around. But aerial view should be the next step of this. Definitely would be another thing to look into down the line. It is a really good question, but we didn't look into it for the study, of course.
Online. Charles Sterling asked, how can your research be applied to broader wildlife conservation? So what are the management implications?
So did you want to start?
Online heard it. You all heard it. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, the really cool thing with this research and the methodology of my view shed, I really think that can be applied to many other ground dwelling, ground nesting animals. The parameters I set are adaptable and flexible, and considering, as long as you consider, the height of the observer, height of the target, and you have information and resources to account for the landscape variation, this can be a tool and a practice used broadly for any species on the land. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that can be applied to larger conservation projects.
Thank you for the great presentation. I was curious, so you did the on the ground vegetation measurements for 3 years, but you were able to apply that to across all the years. Like, how often do you think you would need to measure the vegetation in order to keep these view shed measurements?
Yeah, good. Oh, thanks, Stan. No.
The question was, how did you interpolate the vegetation data?
Yeah.
And how long would you have?
Yeah. Good question, Elizabeth. So I'm not sure how often I would have to. We kind of did what we had to for this study. Ideally, I would have done it every single year. Ideally, I would have sampled at those same points year after year after year to get a more precise estimate and more like accurate measurement of veg height change over time. But given the time constraints and our resources, I think that plotting it those 2 years as well as 2022 kind of gave like some tail ends, of the veg height. And of course there's error there. But ideally I would have done it every year, and even more precisely would have been to measure vegetation at each nest site to really kind of get like local veg height changes over time at each nest location instead of kind of spreading a larger estimate across the whole island. So yeah, my answer would be ideally every year. Ideally every season we would measure vegetation height, but of course that requires physical commitment and other factors. But for what we had to work with, I think it gives a general idea of what the landscape looks like, and improvements can be made for future studies. Thank you.
Yeah, we could do one more question.
Okay, one more question from online. I'm curious if you think nests located in vegetation could be more successful than those located in open areas. Even if plovers are selecting the open areas, could the vegetation provide more cover from predators?
Yeah, definitely. I really think that's a route that, given the loss of red foxes and maybe the increase in aerial predation, I've been kind of hypothesizing that veg coverage could serve as a protection from aerial predators. So although plovers can still see just fine up, the aerial predators may not be able to see as easily down, So as the landscape changes and as the predator community changes, I really think going forward, if the landscape stays how it is and plovers maybe adapting to the different predator conditions, they could be benefiting from nesting in veg